The Ball Theory of Christianity, based upon the work of Glenn Young. Baal and Christianity, Part 5. The theory is based upon Baal, the god portrayed in the Old Testament as the great rival god of Yahweh, whose worship was considered by the prophets as an abomination, is in fact the model for the Christ story, and Christianity is a morphed version of the Baal legend, not a reformed version of Judaism, nor a new covenant with the God Yahweh. Sacrifice and non-sacrifice. That's the theme here of which we are discussing. The Baalist concept of religion required sacrificing of the firstborn in the time of crisis. The old Hebrews accepted that concept to some degree and practiced it in the early times quite often. Now, the new Jews completely rejected that view because they believed that it was the cause for God's wrath leading to the destruction of the first temple and subsequently the captivity. The religion that grew out of the Galilee based on the survivors of the Baalist crisis and the old Hebrews were focused on the Messiah based on simply this: God sacrificing his only son to save all of humankind. Now, this was clearly the Baalist tradition going back 4,000 years before the Jewish concept ever came about. You have to remember this. So, we see the traditions in their writings. As the new religion is formed, it took many elements from the ancients. This included the Greek and Persian traditions and melded them into a single concept. It must be understood that if you study history, there were a number of kingdoms and empires that rose back in that time. Each was an influence upon all the surrounding countries and subsequently people. This had a pronounced impact on their culture. It proclaimed the Son of God came and died for all sins, for the protection of all as a new concept. You see, basically all religion, all the modern religions today are nothing more than a remake of what was at one time believed in a different place and by different people. So when you see a diverse people as the Phoenicians, they were extremely metropolitan, culturally, very well learned. You can begin to see the influence of that region upon the subsequent regions going as far south as Egypt, as far to the west as Spain, and going as far east as China. So the fact was a very ancient and very Phoenician concept. The death and rising of a god was standard in almost all of the religions of the ancient world, but few had the Phoenicians' literal practice of killing of the firstborn for the needs of the god. The Phoenicians just took it to a different level. Now, this is from Wikipedia. It's basically, what is the definition of a god? You know, I ask that question quite often, and people really can't answer it. They can't answer it in a cognitive manner. Well, I think that this does it pretty good. A life, death, rebirth. I think that sums it up. Now, if you can accomplish this, then you are considered God, also known as the dying and rising or resurrection of a deity. So this is what constitute God. I mean, listen, if someone was to kill you and then you got back up, let's say 30 minutes later, and the wound, could still be visible, but you're up and you're doing just fine, well, you would be considered a God. So the requirements are this: 1, who was born; 2, suffers death or a death-like experience; 3, passes through a phase in the underworld among the dead, and finally is subsequently reborn in either a literal or symbolic sense. Now, what we see are the male examples of where we see these sons of God. And they go all the way back until we actually hit the modern guy, of which is now known as Jesus. Now we can see the sky god example morphing out of the far more ancient goddesses tradition. Let me tell you, the male was not first. It was the female. No male can give birth or to anything. Not even a good idea. Female examples are Inna, also known as Ishtar, whose cult dates back to 4000 BCE. And by the way, the patriarch of the three major religions, Christianity, Islam, Judaism. Well, their cat, Abraham, yeah, well, he worshipped Inna. Yeah, really did. So they were the central figure of the Elysium Mysteries, whose cult may date to 1700 BCE as the unnamed goddess worship in Crete. You see, there's no new gods. Never have been. Anytime you see a new religion and they start, like Christianity, that it really is a new kid to the block, and to the table, and they're touting that they got the real God, and then you got the guy on the other side of the table who, let's say, is a Buddhist, a Taoist. However you want to go down this. No one's got the market cornered on who God is, all right? So we have to continue to remember that. What is old is new. Now, you can see each one of these Jesuses, Dionysus, Luciferus, all of them. These are your Jesuses. This is who Jesus was taken from. And Jesus, that's just a made-up name. You can go back, actually, it's Zeus, Iusus. Yeah. You see a connection? What is old is now new. And what is new will someday be old, and it will be new again, just in a different package. We see the ancient story retold and often called the core of Christianity. In John 3:16 and 18, which everybody knows, we see the concept laid out. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. Whoever believes in him is not condemned, but whoever does not believe is condemned already, because he is not believed in the name of the only Son of God. Folks, this was not written by any cat named John. It goes way, way back. Okay, let's continue. So, the Phoenician story. Now we're going to see, are there connections that we can draw from the modern day religion of Christianity with the belief of a Savior and a God that was going to send his Son to pay the sins of all humanity? So, from 12th century BC, reporting about events in 4000 BC, we read almost the whole Christ story. And you can see it's very old and very Baalist. For Cronus, whom the Phoenicians call Il, and who after his death was deified and instated in the planet which bears his name, when king, had by a nymph of the country called her Anabrat, his only son, who on that account is styled I believe that's Eud. For so the Phoenicians still call an only son. And when great dangers from war beset the land, he adorned the altar and invested his son with the emblems of royalty and sacrificed him. There you go. Or in other words, God for Cronus, whom the Phoenicians call Il, and who after his death was deified. Now, here's where the story gets really kind of interesting and compelling. In the story of Cronus, he impregnates a young girl, had by a nymph of the country called Anabret, had one son, who on that account is styled after what we would see going back to the story of Isaac and Abraham all the way up into the supposed murdering of one that was a deified deity. So the Phoenicians still call an only son. And in that time of danger declared the son the king, and when the great dangers from war beset the land, he adorned the altar and invested his son with the emblems of royalty. In other words, and then he, for salvation, was killed and sacrificed. That's how the story goes. You sacrifice the one of the royalty in order to save the kingdom. It's a very ancient concept. Christianity doesn't have a corner on it. No religion actually has a corner on it. So let's look at the Christian version. The concept of the sacrifice of God, or the Son of God, is core to Christianity, but was in fact the anthemia to Judaism, or at least the Judaism of the dominant returnees of the Jews from captivity. Now remember, only about 10% returned. The rest stayed. They moved on to Egypt. They moved north. Most people don't realize that. To the Jews of the time, the idea of human sacrifice was the root cause of God's anger at the Jewish people and the subsequent destruction of their kingdom and their exile to Babylon. So let's continue. The influences on early Christianity came from this. The missing influence is the Phoenicians. It's the key factor to really understanding the whole concept. In times of crisis, God sacrificed his only begotten son. Where did the idea come from? It was contrary to Jewish concepts post-exile, cause of God's wrath. It was not found in Egypt. It was not found in death and dying cults. They may have died and reborn, but the gods were not sacrificed. It was not found in the Persian concepts. It is only seen in Phoenician culture beliefs, the rites of Baalism. Yeah. Remember, folks, the Old Testament is not the Old Testament. It's called an Old Testament, of which no one has a right to, if you want to actually get right down to it, unless you were a Hebrew, but it's not that old. In fact, if you want to get real specific about it, it's kind of really very still new in the annals of the chronology of man's existence. You've got to remember these things. Now, Jesus as Baal. Indeed, the story the Christians rolled out was ancient, and the details well known to the people of Phoenicia and all the lands of that influence. As found in the newly found and translated writing of the Phoenicians, the detail of the Christ story was in fact part of the Baal epic. I know it's hard. Yeah. Always is when the illusion suddenly is replaced by the reality of fact. Let's continue. In 1921, the edition of the Journal of the Royal Estic Society, a scholar named H. Zimmern described stage directions for a sort of miracle play performed at the temple of Bel Marduk, i.e. Baal, annually. In this play, Baal was bound and brought before the tribunal which awaits mankind on the bank of the river of death. He was scourged, condemned to death, and then led away to a prison house. Sounding vaguely familiar? Another malefactor was led also away to execution, while a second one was released. The story of Barbers. We all know it. Cecil B. DeMille's great Hollywood production. And that is, in fact, what most people based their belief in Christianity on, is Hollywood. Hollywood has brought a make-believe scene alive in people's minds. But we continue. Once Baal was put in prison, the city was plunged into confusion, and his clothes were stripped from his body. A goddess then washed away blood that had flowed from a wound in the side of Baal. And eventually he rose from the dead after his followers lamented. And there you can check the reference out for yourself. Yeah. I know the feeling as well, huh? Baal recreated. The ancient story of the Phoenicians was simply retold in a new setting with a new name. Lord literally means and is Baal, and Baal is Lord, and Jesus is Baal, and Baal is Jesus. I know. Now people say, well, this is heresy. No, this is history. This is the real history. You see, the problem is, when you base a religion on fictitious settings and you try to destroy with Ernst the written history, eventually someone forgot something and it is eventually brought out. It was a familiar story to all people in the area and familiar enough to all the religions of the Western world at the time. But the story was too close to human sacrifice for the new Jews. The sacrifice of the Son of Man was the cause of Yahweh's, God's wrath in the past. They firmly believed this. And you have to understand history again. Remember, when they were taken by force, some say that they actually made a deal, but who knows? None of us lived back then. Into captivity, into Babylon. Folks, they lost their history. They lost their religion. They'd already pretty well lost it at that point. No one can remember the name of God. It's forbidden to speak it. It's said that maybe a few had it because if you spoke it, great portals would open up and that it brought in, things that you don't want to be dealing with. Does not the Bible say to stand in the presence of God is a terrible thing? So this whole sacrificing of a son of God, the Son of Man, is not new. We continue. The Jews now come into power. As we have seen, from 325 to 150 BC, Hellenistic Greek conquers the eastern portion of that region. Persia, Greek, Egypt. You get the idea. They bring in the Greek culture. That challenged the view of both Baalist and Yahwist. You see, we so often when we read about the exploits of Alexander the Great and then his generals that later really set the whole pace for history, we forget that the fact there were competing beliefs taking place there. Now, this is when the whole region was Hellenized. Now, while the Phoenicians They had fared far better than the Yahwist in the previous 1,000 years of invasions. This time, they got the worst of it. Alexander destroyed Phoenicia. Phoenicia had been a major ally with the Persians. Alexander wanted revenge for the burnings of Athens by the Persians. He came with wrath. Anything that he saw associated with the Persians, they received the wrath. At that time, what would have been considered God. I know, it gets stranger. However, the Jewish colony offered no resistance to Alexander, and he had a distaste for them to begin with. Remember, you have to read the history. When Alexander came through there, he set 50 cities in what is called Judea, Lebanon, Israel. He Hellenized the whole area. You have to understand that when you come in as a conquering army, the way to get cooperation is not to so much, how should we say, rub it in your face. You're now an indentured servant. You're now going to be beholden to the conqueror. But the conqueror is going to be not benevolent completely, but benevolent in the way that he's going to allow you to keep your religion. But all the while, they're going to be incorporating it into theirs. This is how it works. For the next 150 years or so, the Jewish colony is passed between rival successors of Alexander. Reference the complete works of Josephus. Mainly left alone, the colony prospers and the population grows. Many Jews like the new lifestyle and start to become Greek. But soon a new challenge is created. Now, if you will actually read the history of the first century of the Judean area, you will find out that the actual thing that you think is this, let's say, the strictest side of Judaism, it was a minor player, very minor. By far, and the greatest percentages of the Jews of that time considered themselves to be more Greek than Jew or Hebrew. The Syrian-based Greek king tries to make everyone Hellenized, requiring Jews to abandon rituals and engage in sacrifices to Greek gods and the living king. Some Jews seem willing to accept or feel they have not a choice, but they really didn't. Others start a revolt, and much to the surprise, all they win. Again, read the Jew Wars. You'll learn what's happening here. Read the Maccabees. Yes, those books that they took out. You know why they took them out? Because they can't explain it to you, because they paint a different story of history. In a long, hard series of wars of the Maccabean revolts, the Jews established a truly independent kingdom, some 350 years after the fall of the first state. You have to understand the politics that was taking place. I can't get into it. It would take hours for me to educate you in this. You would have to become educated. But once you do, you will dispel the sin of ignorance, because now you're gaining knowledge. Critical fact we need to know, between 140 BC and 140 AD, there was at least 4 major rebellions of the Jews. You getting this? And perhaps dozens of other revolts against the Greek and Roman rule and culture by the Jews. It was bloody, folks. Bloody. I mean, we see today skirmishes in areas of conflict, Iraq, Afghanistan, etc., where we may see the death of soldiers, maybe 4 or 5, and we consider this a great loss, and it is. But back in this time, we're talking 30, 50,000 men dying in battles. We're talking ambushes of where it's not a couple, it's thousands slayed. Now, being a new Jew was an important rallying point that sustained the first revolt and all the other future revolts. These Jewish wars of resistance against the classical domination, the Greek then the Roman, changed both the nature of Judaism and how the new rulers of the world viewed the people and their religion. The Second Jewish Commonwealth, under strong new Jewish Orthodox religious control, expanded to include most of what is now Israel, Jordan, and parts of Syria and Lebanon. As the new nation expanded, its forces converted the peoples of the new areas, including Galilee and the southern Phoenicia, to the new Jewish religion. Remember, if you even will read your Old Testament, there has never been a united Israel. They're tribes. The north and the south was split. It's just the facts. These areas were only new Jewish for about 100 years at the time of the supposed Christ. The repression was brutal and focused on all out of favored practices, including the old Jewish and Kabbalist concept of the need for human sacrifice. Folks, there was a lot of killing. Your door could be busted open, and you could see your family slayed by the sword. And typically the males were brought out to see the death of their family for daring to believe in that which is the standard mantra of the day. Starting about 65 BC, the Second Commonwealth falls apart in a dynastic infighting. This was the problem with the Jews. They were never united. Josephus clearly stated that. Rome slowly absorbs the state from an ally. Remember, read history. It was the Jews that went to the Romans to get rid of the Greeks. To a client, to a colony. The Jews are once again faced with a crisis as Rome's Hellenistic culture competes and then fights against the new Jewish religion. This led to a loss of power. The areas that were forced, converted, and held as Jewish for 100 years slipped away from Jewish control. You see, so many have this mindset that what you're seeing portrayed in the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, is a long-lived religious tradition. It is not. It's anything but. The land becomes one of both political and religious revolt. The old faiths are revised under new acceptable formats. Wrapped in new Jewish traditions, the Kabbalist tradition of the need for a human sacrifice is revived. Rejection of Christians. The traditional answer for the Jewish rejection of Jesus is that he failed. Isn't it odd? You know, you read your New Testament, particularly your Gospels, and folks, it's nothing more than political propaganda. It's pro-Roman. Never written in a pro-Jewish point of view. Now, as a physical Messiah to liberate the country from the Romans. In fact, if you will read the story, you will find many of the supposed followers of this Messiah were just that. They were, well, what you would call today patriotic groups. They were looking for a leader who would deliver them from the oppression of the Romans. But the cornerstone to the issue of the rejection was the storyline, developed by not what was called Christians. And we got to get this term. That Christians didn't come into way later, but for purpose, we'll just say Christians here, for the need for a human sacrifice to God. That's what the religion is based on, human sacrificing. any way you slice it and dice it. Early Christians even saw Christ as the continuation of the Isaac story, only this time the sacrifice was completed. Christians have stated over the centuries that the failure of Abraham to sacrifice Isaac was the root cause of God's displeasure with the Jews. Now, you read a different story. Understand that story has been changed so that you will believe in a particular path of thought. And boy, it's been a good one, hasn't it? The Christ, quote unquote, sacrifice completed the deal for a new covenant sealed in human blood. Something right out of the Ballast beliefs. No difference. In that time, the Jews' rejection, with the history of the Jews and the explanation for the destruction of the first temple being the practice of human sacrifice. No wonder the Jews could not accept this new Christian story. It was to them a revival of the practice of passing the children through the fire in a new storyline. And it's replete in the New Testament. That concept is throughout the writings. Response to the political and religious crisis. In response to crises such as culture conflicts, as the classical Jewish wars, we find some universal responses. We find one, acceptors, those who went Greek. They just went Bohemian, man. Two, the resistors, active and passive Maccabees, the Essenes. Read the stories, the Maccabee Wars. Three, mergers. Oh, here's my guy, Philo of Alexandria. You know why Philo is here, folks? He is the foundation to Christianity. You want to know where your Trinity comes from? This cat right here. Anyway, and then the morphers, those who attempt to maintain the old ways by masking them with new terminology. What happened to each of the groups among the Jews? I'll tell you what happened on this. One, the acceptors merged into new world order, became part of the new classical culture, and later the Christian world. Two, the resistors, destroyed in series of wars, mainly ending in the Bar Kokhba revolt. 2/3 of the Jews in the empire were killed. Did you know that? Yeah. Mergers. Concept failed and was mainly rejected by both sides. And then the morphers. That is the question. Was Christianity the morphed version of the ancient worldview, or something that is completely new to the consciousness of mankind? Jewish destruction. And as the history played out, with the return of the concept of human sacrifice needed to appease God into the area through the Christians, in fact, came about. From about 60 AD to 140 AD, as Christianity became more widespread, the Jewish state, the Second Temple, and almost all of the Jews themselves were destroyed. It's amazing when you look at this period of time, 60 AD to 145 AD. Read the Romans account. Go and read Josephus' account. Read Philo's account. Read the other philosophers of the day. There is so much missing from most people's understanding that they've replaced it with suspicion, opinion, or just flat out made up fallacies. Judaism almost eliminated. The end of the resistors. From 66 AD to 135 AD, Rome crushed a series of 3 major and a number of minor Jewish revolts and destroyed Judea, the Second Temple, and nearly exterminates the Jews in much of the eastern Mediterranean world. It was close to genocide. In 135 AD, Jews were barred from the Holy Land, and the city of Jerusalem was renamed after a Roman god. Bet you didn't know that, did you? Yeah, so where was their God at? What, he switched sides now? Now he's a Christian God, fighting for the Romans. I don't know. And as you can see here, from Titus's destruction of the temple, now imagine his brother, here you can see, coins of the first revolt, 66 AD, there they are, folks. There's the temple. Now look at here. This is from the Third Great Revolt, 135 AD. There's no longer any temple. Judaism is almost eliminated. Through the centuries of revolts in the Roman world, Jews went from being a curious accepted group, which soon gained followers that were as much as 10% of the whole empire's population, to the most hated group in the empire, at least by the rulers of the empire. The great Colosseum in Rome was actually paid for by the spoils of the conquest of the Jews and built primarily by Jew slaves who survived the wars after the crushing of the 66-70 AD. Flavius Titus. From the Arch of Titus in Rome, the wreath, the wealth of Jerusalem, is displayed. There it is. What's your answer for this again? You know, bet you there were many of them, many Jewish people that died wondering where was their God? What had they done to deserve to incur into to have his wrath poured out upon them? What did they do? Yeah. Now the Christians, the small little cults, that's what they were, cults at the time, sat out the Great Revolt of 66-70. For the most parts, these are Jews. One of the few Jewish groups to do so. They watched their kin be slaughtered. In part, the early rejection of the Christians by the Jews can be found in those politics. When all were needed to fight the Romans, the followers of Jesus refused to help. Why the anti-Jewish vent in Gospels. And as the first revolt failed and more revolts developed, the defeat of the Jews and the non-participation of the Christians and the anti-Jewish policies of the empire can be seen reflected in the Gospels. The earliest written, and before the Great Revolt, 66 to 70 AD, or just after, was less clear on the guilt of the Jews in the death of Christ. The later Gospels, written after the wars, blamed the Jews and held the Romans harmless. The Gospels reflect the political realities of the time with a pro-Roman view. As Rome expanded, many religions, old and new, became popular with the Roman people. Christianity had many competitors. From Egypt, it was Isis. From Persia, Mithra. And before the revolts, the Jewish God. The Romans were, they were an all-accepting group. Well, come on in. They try everything. And also in many forms, from the old Phoenician and Syria, Baal. Yeah, Baal was actually pretty popular. You won't read that. So for 3,000 years before Jesus or Jesus, here's Isis and Horus as the model for the modern day story of Jesus and Mary. It's old, folks. Really old. Goes way back. These were the really popular gods for hundreds of years of the Roman Empire. and after the beginning of Christianity. And once again, contrary to Christian history of the world, Christianity was at first very slow to prosper and was not widely embraced by the Roman world for centuries. Some say, if at all. Remember, it was the emperor, who made the decision. Yeah. But we read a different story. This is end of part 5. There's one last part 6 to this. And when we conclude in this study, I believe you are going to be amazed.